Hi people, welcome to my video. Today I'm going to be talking to you about why I think you should write every story like it's fantasy fiction. I've been thinking about this for a while because I think for me one of the big things that really draws me into a story is whether it has a really strong sense of place. Lots of description, like a really good sense of reality about where the story is set. I think if you can make the setting believable, that goes a long way into making the rest of your story believable. If the setting feels real, then the characters are going to feel real to me. If I can believe that they're walking down a street, I'm going to also believe that they've got all this conflict and all these struggles that they're going through. So I'm going to be much more forgiving about investing my time in that. So I really don't think you can underestimate the importance that world building has when you're writing any kind of story. But the problem is, I think, that world building isn't something that gets talked about a lot in contemporary fiction. If you think world building, you think articles about making your fantasy world believable. Like, is your currency, does your currency make sense? Is the language that you've made up believable? Does it all hang together? Because when you're writing a fantasy, you're creating a world from scratch. So you've got to work extra hard to make it believable. It's the same with historical fiction. You're writing a world that your reader isn't familiar with. So you put the extra effort into making it seem real. So you go the extra mile and you talk a lot more about all the little details that are going to make the world spring to life, because you know that your reader isn't familiar with it. They're not going to read your sentence about the fields over Middle Earth and know immediately what you're talking about. Whereas in contemporary fiction, if you talk about, Brighton or a residential street or Asda, the likelihood is that most of your readers are going to know what you're talking about because it's contemporary, because we live in a contemporary world. But I think that is where contemporary writing sometimes falls down a little. For me, personally. Because world building, as I say, is not really something that's talked about as a necessity in contemporary fiction. So I'm going to read a quote from one of my favourite books, Olivia Scarlett, which is by Rosemary Sutcliffe, and it's set in the Bronze Age. The boy stopped playing with the dog's ears and laid his arm across his updrawn knees and his chin on his arm, gazing southward where the chalk fell in long, slow turf slopes and ridges, below willow and hazel-choked combs, into the forest and the marsh country far below, and the marshes spread away and away to the shining bar of the great water on the edge of the world. A little warm wind came up from the south, trailing the cloud shadows after it across the marshes, and up the slow-gathering slopes of the chalk, thyme-scented and sea-scented, and swaying the heads of the blue scabious flowers all one way. The shadow of a hawk swept across the turf below him, and the sun was hot on his head. The day was good. I love that passage anyway, but I think it's so beautifully written because Sutcliffe knows that we don't immediately know what Bronze Age England looked like. We don't know the vision of Bronze Age England that she has in her head. So again, she goes into so much detail to make this setting, this scene that she's describing, feel 3D and authentic. So there is extra detail. She talks about the temperature, she talks about the scent, she talks about how it feels, how it's going to smell. She does everything to try and make the world seem 3D and real and genuine, because she knows that she has to, because otherwise people just aren't familiar with it. So I think that's why maybe a lot of contemporary writers don't bother to go into that level of description, because they think, why? What's the point? Because people are aware of this. People know what world they live in. They know the world that I'm writing in, so why? But I think you're missing a trick if you don't go to the levels of detail that historical and fantasy fiction often has to go to. There's an idea, I think it's in Russian literary theory, called defamiliarization. And the idea of that is that you can greatly enhance your understanding and appreciation of something familiar if you present it in an unfamiliar way. You defamiliarize it, so the familiar becomes unfamiliar. And in that way, by seeing something from a new angle, you gain a deeper and more special understanding of that thing. It's a bit like Cubism, when Picasso would paint faces from all angles, and it's like, even though the face is familiar, because he's presented it in this strange new way, it's like a whole new face, and people see Picasso painting and their immediate reaction is, what the hell? Because even though it's a face and it's familiar, because he's presented it in this way, it's something entirely new and different. There's another quote that I'm going to talk about from Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. It was a city in which the very old and the awkwardly new jostled against each other, not uncomfortably but without respect. A city of shops and offices and restaurants and homes, of parks and churches, of ignored monuments and remarkably unpalatial palaces. A city of hundreds of districts with strange names, Crouch End, Chalk Farm, Earl's Court, Marble Arch, and oddly distinct identities. A noisy, dirty, cheerful, troubled city, which fed on tourists, needed them as it despised them, in which the average speed of transportation through the city had not increased in 300 years, following 500 years of fitful road widening and unskillful compromises between the needs of traffic, whether horse-drawn or, more recently, motorised, and the needs of pedestrians. A city inhabited by and teeming with people of every colour and manner and kind. Now here Gaiman is writing about modern London, but the way that he writes about it is as if he is describing a fantasy city, even though the majority of readers probably will be aware of what modern London is, and they will have some idea of it. Gaiman talks about it as though it's something completely new and exotic. He puts in all these details that make it seem like he's world building somewhere where we've never been before. And I mean, that ties in really well with the novel, which is all about this secret underground London, which is like a magical mirror to the London that's above, that people actually are familiar with. But when he writes like this, it's like even the modern London is as weird and as interesting as the magical one. And he achieves that through writing about the magical London and the modern London the same way, because as if they're both fantasies. I think I see this level of detail a lot in urban fantasy. I think because cities like London tend to really lend themselves well to like seeing the extra magic and then energy, because London's been written about for years, centuries. So I think it's a lot easier, and people can see that magic a lot more clearly. Kate Griffin's Matthew Swift novels are really good with this. And they're an urban fantasy. And also I recently read Jess Kidd's Things in Jars, and that's a historical novel, and it's set in London. And they both present London as like this amazing, special place, because one's writing about it from a magical point of view and one's writing about it from a historical point of view. But it's the level of detail that they put in that really makes it shine. It really makes it interesting. Even though maybe your local Beano cafe doesn't seem at first glance quite as magical as London, I think you should still give it a try. Write about it like it's a historical fiction. Write about it like it's fantasy. And just see what happens. That's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Bye.